Good evening. Welcome to our Hub Talks with Chris Hedges, Dr. Noam Chomsky, and Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl on religious nationalism and the American-Israeli-Saudi alliance. I'm your host, Zachary Markwith, and I'd like to thank our speakers for sharing their research, experience, and wisdom with us. This evening we have a Christian Presbyterian minister critiquing American militarism and the Christian right, an eminent Jewish linguist critiquing the Israeli occupation and Zionism, and a Muslim jurist critiquing the Saudi royal family and Wahhabism. Apologies that this ecumenical gathering of ours could not also include Hindu and Buddhist critiques of Hindu and Buddhist nationalism in India and Myanmar. There does, however, seem to be a common ethical impulse that runs through all cultures and religions, the heart of which is the Golden Rule. We read in the Hebrew Bible, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," and in the Gospel, "Inasmuch as you have done it unto the least of these, my brethren, you have done it unto me." And in the Quran, "Whoever slays a soul, it is as if he has slew all of humanity, and whoever saves a life, it is though he has saved the life of all of humanity." Yet we have failed ourselves, our very humanity, if we think that the Golden Rule, ethics, or human rights only apply to those in our tribe, our race, our religion, or our nation. Indeed, nationalism is the new golden calf. What are the connections between religious nationalism in the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia? How are these three nations allied? And should we reconsider these alliances? These are questions for our speakers, but I would first like to offer a few preliminary reflections. All three nations are outgrowths of British imperialism at the expense of indigenous peoples. The United States, formerly British colonies, was built by exterminating Native Americans and enslaving Africans. Israel was built with the support of the British government through the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which was addressed to Lord Rothschild and announced support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people at the expense of Semitic Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Palestine and the greater Middle East. Saudi Arabia and Wahhabism were also supported by the British during World War I against the Ottomans, as well as moderate Sunnis, Shia, and Sufis of Arabia. Today, even though they still enjoy British support, Israel and Saudi are for all intents and purposes protectorates of the United States, which supplies billions of dollars in financial aid and arms to essentially rule the region by proxy. Before we commence, I would also like to remember Jamal Khashoggi, may he rest in peace, who was murdered at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October 2nd, likely at the behest of the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. We can also remember the 40 Yemeni school children whose bus was bombed by the Saudi government with US arms on August 9th, and thousands more who have died in other attacks. We can remember the hundreds of peaceful protesters in Gaza who were killed by the Israeli military this year, with American financial support and political cover, while the Trump family celebrated moving the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. Among the killed was an unarmed Palestinian nurse, Razan al-Najjar, who was killed on June 1st by an Israeli sniper while helping a wounded protester. And as we know, wars and crimes against humanity are also waged directly and at a much greater scale by the United States with bipartisan support. If there is one thing that links the US, Israel, and Saudi today, it seems to be their desire to isolate and threaten Iran with a new war. The moment has come for us to speak up for peace, justice, truth, and human rights, to not allow neoconservatives, the Christian right, and hawks in both wings of the military-industrial complex to define America and Christianity, to not allow settlers and hawks in Israel to define Judaism, to not allow Wahhabis and the Saudi royal family to define Islam. The time has come to pledge ourselves to building and sustaining a viable anti-war movement and culture, to pledge to ourselves, our children, our neighbors, and the world that we will not support politicians and businesses that profit from war, that we will teach and embody peace and justice with one another as individuals and nations. It's my pleasure to turn to our eminent speakers. We're first joined by Chris Hedges, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, New York Times best-selling author, professor at Princeton University, activist, and ordained Presbyterian minister. He has written 11 books, including War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, American Fascists, The Christian Right and the War on America, and America, The Farewell Tour. Please join me in welcoming Chris Hedges.
So I'm going to talk about the Christian right and American militarism, and they are inextricably linked. I come out of a religious tradition. My father was a Presbyterian minister. My mother was a seminary graduate and a college professor. I graduated from Harvard Divinity School. For the last 10 years, I've taught in a prison in New Jersey, where most of my students are Muslim, and was ordained for that work. The ordination sermon was given by America's greatest contemporary theologian, Dr. James Cone, and Cornel West spoke, and we threw out the Presbyterian hymnals, hired a blues band, and invited the families of all of my students who I teach in prison. It's on YouTube. You can watch it. My father was very involved in the anti-war movement. He was a World War II veteran, had been in North Africa, and Palestine, and later Iran during World War II. In fact, he was a Farsi speaker. Very involved in the civil rights movement. We lived in a farm town in upstate New York where at that time Martin Luther King in these rural white enclaves was one of the most hated men in America. And he was very close to the Catholic worker movement. He was a member of Concerned Clergy and Laity, started by Phil and Daniel Berrigan. This was the formation of my understanding of belief, that it was a constant struggle for justice, and that you stood with the oppressed, and that when you truly stood with the oppressed, eventually you would be treated like the oppressed. This is what it meant for me to have a religious life. It was coupled with the understanding that when you held fast to that moral imperative, the principalities, the powers would always seek to silence, marginalize you, and that if you spoke in the kind of prophetic voice that Martin Luther King spoke in or Malcolm X spoke in, they would often kill you. When I was at Harvard, my great mentor was James Luther Adams. In 1936 and 37, he was in Germany during the Nazi rule at the University of Heidelberg. He was in the lecture hall watching Martin Heidegger begin his lectures with a Nazi salute. He once told us that if the Nazis took over America, 60% of the Harvard faculty would willingly begin their lectures with the Nazi salute. And when we laughed, he said, no, I watched it within the universities in Nazi Germany. He dropped out of the university. He joined the underground confessing church led by Niemöller, Bonhoeffer, Albert Schweitzer, and Karl Barth until he himself was picked up by the Gestapo and expelled from Germany a year later. During that year, he took roles of home movie film, not only of Germany and the confessing church, but the so-called German Christian church, which was pro-Nazi and which had a huge following, especially among Protestants. And on one side of the altar was the Christian cross, and on the other side was the Nazi swastika. And that experience in Germany deeply revolutionized him and informed his understanding of faith. And he told us, this was 1983, that when we were his age, and he was 80 years old at the time, we would all be fighting the Christian fascists. Because he understood that when you dispossessed your working class, when you created economic misery and stagnation, when a cabal seized power and directed all of the institutions of government towards the further consolidation of that power and wealth, eventually you would vomit up figures and movements that replicated what he had seen with the breakdown of Weimar Germany. I left Harvard Divinity School. I was gone for 20 years, overseas on the outer reaches of empire. I was the Middle East bureau chief. I spent, for the New York Times, I spent 7 years in the Middle East. And largely divorced from America and American culture until I returned. And when I returned, the Christian right in that 2 decades had exponentially grown into a powerful and frightening political movement. And so I set out to write 10 years ago a book called American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America. I was trying to reach out to them. I went into that investigation, and I heavily report. I'm at heart, I remain a newspaper reporter. I like reporting, I like listening. It forces me to confront and often demolishes my own assumptions that I carry into a project. And it's only, I find, with that visceral contact that I begin to understand what cultures and societies and movements which are foreign to me are truly about. So I went into my study of the Christian right with the prejudices of the Christian left. I'm not even sure I would call it liberal. I don't think the Berrigans were liberal, but I think they were an expression for me of what the Christian religion at its best is about. Although I would say that I have seen in my 20 years abroad, out of every culture and every religion and every ethnicity, magnificent figures rise up to fight the oppressor on behalf of the oppressed. And for me, these are always expressions of that deep religious impulse that I admire, that understanding that there are things that do not have a monetary value, but have an intrinsic value, a fight and a protection of the sacred. And so in many ways, although I was biblically literate, theologically literate, the movement that I entered was a foreign entity. And I went with a fair amount of disdain towards this movement. And yet, after numerous interviews, dozens of interviews with followers of this movement, I could not walk away unmoved by the tremendous suffering, dislocation, and pain that the rupture of social bonds in American society had done to these individuals. Addictions, domestic, sexual abuse, chronic underemployment, unemployment, jail time. Their lives had disintegrated because of this corporate onslaught because of the corporate coup d'etat that's taken place within our culture, the seizure of power by a corporate cabal. I was also appalled at the way the leaders of these mega churches, almost invariably white men, like Donald Trump, preyed on the despair of these people to become incredibly wealthy and to hold these people in a system that is probably most accurately described as a cult. I was at a pro-life weekend in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, with 400 women. And the organizers of this event asked the post-abortive sisters to stand, and the room stood. And when I went around and did interviews, it turned out that these women had not had one abortion, but multiple abortions. And what did the Christian right do? They gave these women dolls, and they told them that these were the children they had murdered. And they were told to name the dolls and dress the dolls and bathe the dolls and sleep with the dolls. And at the end of the weekend, they had to hold up those dolls and beg for forgiveness and pledge to fight the culture of death, which is us. It was the manipulation of their guilt and their shame. And so while I had an unexpected empathy and compassion for what these people had suffered, I also understood how dangerous this movement was. One of the fascinating aspects of that work was that I'm always upfront about who I am and where I came from and what my religious background is. And as soon as they knew that I came out of a religious background, they never wanted to speak about the Bible with me because they don't know the Bible any more than ISIS or Al Qaeda knows the Quran. They are fed selected bits and slogans. They are selective literalists. And they use this to feed an ideology. And of course, what the Christian right has done is sacralize the worst aspects of American capitalism, white supremacy, racism, and American imperialism. It is a political movement. And if you doubt me, go home tonight if you have a television, I don't, and watch an hour of Pat Robertson on the 700 Club or any of these other quote-unquote Christian networks. That's the reason 81% of evangelicals voted for Trump and why he has to this day a 75% approval rating. Now, what this movement does is essentially play on that despair, that desperation, and peddles magical thinking, magic Jesus. I mean, the whole idea that Jesus came to make us rich or shower us with consumer products is heretical. And one of my frustrations, even anger, at the liberal Christian church is that they have failed to call these people out for who they are, which is Christian heretics. I was in the Middle East immediately after 9/11. I covered Al-Qaeda for the New York Times in the aftermath of the attacks. And I had frequently heard denunciations, which actually were untrue, leveled against Muslim leaders for not denouncing the crime against humanity that was carried out on 9/11. In fact, and I was there, Muslim leaders throughout the Middle East denounced the crimes of 9/11. But I couldn't help thinking, where are those Christian figures who are denouncing the Christian heretics? the Christian fascists. Now, I don't use the word fascist lightly. In fact, when I finished the book, Bill Moyers tried very energetically to talk me out of using that word in the title. And I went to two great scholars of fascism, Fritz Stern, who wrote The Politics of Cultural Despair and fled Nazi Germany when he was 18, and Robert Paxton, who wrote Anatomy of Fascism and is the great scholar on Vichy at Columbia. And I spent hours with both of them, essentially laying out for them what I had found and allowing them to try and argue me out of using the word fascist. All totalitarian movements, as Hannah Arendt understood, embrace magical thinking. They are non-reality-based belief movements. And the system of creating cults within these megachurches, the system of divorcing tens of millions of Americans from the fact-based world, the real world, the system of preaching magic set the ground for Trump. And it's born out of despair. I was in Detroit with Tim LaHaye, who wrote the End Times series. There was a conference on the End Times with all of the fantasies that the Christian right peddle about the end times, like the rapture, which is not in the Bible. And the only word I could use to describe the mood in that hall was exhilaration about the apocalypse. Because it was that fact-based world, it was the reality-based world that almost destroyed them that was now being destroyed. You cannot argue these people out of their magical thinking. I was in the Creationist Museum in Peterborough, Kentucky. It's a huge museum with large lots for the school buses. And they brought in the people who did the animatronic, the models for Universal Studios. So they recreate the Garden of Eden with a waterfall and Adam and Eve, plastic figures, but of course positioned so you can't see Eve's breasts or anything. And there's a T-Rex in the Garden of Eden with a saddle on it. And the guide is taking the group around and explaining that I'm sure you all wonder why the T-Rex has such big teeth. It's because Adam and Eve used the T-Rex to open the coconuts. Which is funny here, but it's not funny when you're with 50 or 60 people who believe it. I came to the conclusion that the only way to break the back of that movement was to reintegrate these people back into the economy. And then the latest book that I wrote, which is about the pathologies that are rippling across the United States, the opioid addiction, sexual sadism, we're a pornified culture, suicide, gambling. I was especially rooted in the sociologist Emile Durkheim's book on suicide, where he asked the question, what is it that drives individuals and societies to carry out acts of willful self-annihilation? And he said those individuals and societies that were rooted in communal structures, for whom the social bonds were not broken, who had the possibility of self-actualization, were the least susceptible to suicide. But once those social bonds were broken, once people fell into a position of stagnation and despair, then they began to carry out pathologies of self-destruction, what sociologists call diseases of despair. So that Trump is not the disease. Trump is the symptom of a decayed society, just as I saw in the former Yugoslavia. Now, the danger of these Christian fascists is that they externalize evil. Anyone who studies philosophy or theology or ethics understands, as Primo Levi wrote, that the greatest struggle within us is to grasp our own capacity for evil. I saw this in war. How the line between the victimizer and the victim was often razor thin. And Primo Levi probably articulates this most eloquently in his essay on the Lodz ghetto with Romkowski. And that it is that awareness of our own capacity for evil that is the best protection against our participation in projects of evil. But when you externalize evil, the way the Christian right does or the way Trump does, then evil becomes embodied in individuals or groups that must be eradicated. Noam and I have both been very outspoken against the new atheists, Sam Harris and the late Christopher Hitchens. I debated Sam Harris at UCLA. I debated Hitchens at Berkeley. Not an experience I would wish on anyone in this room. And they are secular fundamentalists. Noam has called them religious fanatics for the state religion. Fundamentalism can come in any form. It can come in secular form. It can come in religious form. It can come through totalitarian ideologies, communism, fascism. And that's why, of course, there is a convergence of political beliefs between the quote-unquote new atheists and the Christian right. The Christian right wants to support and expand our wars in the Middle East to attack Muslims who they say embrace a satanic religion, and Sam Harris and the new atheists want to attack Muslims because in the name of Western civilization, because they're barbarian. But it's all at its core fundamentalism. And the projection and the sacralization of military power, which is at the core of the Christian right. And we are watching within the military a huge expansion of quote-unquote evangelical or Christian right preachers. We are watching the ideological void, because Trump has no ideology. We are watching that vacuum being rapidly filled by these Christian fascists. That is why they push so hard to get Kavanaugh on the bench. And the Christian right made it very clear to the Trump administration that he had to be placed there before the midterms, because they knew that he would revoke Roe v. Wade. So how do we respond? We are not going to break this movement, which I think has a huge crossover in terms of the 70 million people who support Trump. I think Trump in many ways embodies the cult-like character of the people who run the Christian right. And I was in a room with many of these people, including James Dobson, who is as evil as he looks. we are going to have to grapple with what Durkheim calls the anomie within American society, which literally translated is rulelessness. And what Durkheim understood is that it's when the rules, as they're laid out, however imperfectly within the society, no longer work. You work hard, you get a good education, you obey the law, there is a place for you. And in fact, as Matt Taibbi wrote in his book called Divide, which is a study of the legal system for the 1%, for the Wall Street financiers and criminals, Goldman Sachs in particular, and what the judicial system does to the vulnerable and the poor. So these people have, in essence, organized a tax boycott, and you have poor counties like St. Louis County, which are extracting 30 or 40%, or depend on 30, 40% of their budget by extracting money from poor people in Ferguson by imposing ridiculous fines. That's how Eric Garner was killed, although he was charged with selling loose cigarettes, but he wasn't. And you're fined for having an open container or not mowing your lawn. I'm not making any of this up. Or my favorite is obstructing pedestrian traffic, which means standing too long on a sidewalk. There is nothing now to halt the corporate disemboweling of the United States. And that disemboweling is expanding the kind of despair and anomie that propels people into the arms of demagogues who peddle magical thinking. And people wonder, how can the Christian right make an alliance with Trump? And I say, you don't understand the Christian right. Trump embodies all of the characteristics of the leaders of the Christian right, with, at least from my anecdotal observation, one exception, and that is the sexual proclivities of the leaders in the Christian right are probably kinkier. It's a seamless fit, and it's a dangerous movement, and it is fascist, and it is heretical, and it needs to be called out. And as Noam has pointed out, we may get rid of Trump, but Pence, who is a creature of this movement, is even more dangerous. And so we must stop personalizing our problems in the figure of Trump, however repugnant and vile and vulgar and imbecilic he is. He is a creation of a failed democracy. And we must mobilize to fight these predatory systems of corporate power, which means sustained acts of mass civil disobedience, non-cooperation, and organization so that we can pit power against power. Because if we do not address the root cause of our decline, which is anomie, which is the externalization of evil and the sacralization of military force, then we will continue on the road to tyranny. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for that stirring talk. It's my pleasure to now introduce Professor Noam Chomsky, who's Laureate Professor of Linguistics at the University of Arizona and Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at MIT. He's a public intellectual and leading critic of U.S. foreign policy, the mainstream news media, neoliberalism, and the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Dr. Chomsky is the author of numerous works, including The Fateful Triangle, The United States, Israel, and the Palestinians, Manufacturing Consent, and Gaza in Crisis, Reflection on Israel's War against the Palestinians. Please join me in welcoming one of the great geniuses of the 20th and 21st century, Dr. Noam Chomsky.
Thank you very much. First comment, can you hear me? Okay. If I get too far from the microphone, start waving your hands. That often happens. Well, as you just heard, I wrote a book 35 years ago called Fateful Triangle. The three in the triangle were the United States, Israel, and the Palestinians. There were others in the background, Saudi Arabia among them. And what I'd like to do now is say a few words about a different fateful triangle, the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, with others in the background. And in the background now are the Palestinians. The shift in focus over 35 years reflects changes in policies and practices. So 35 years ago, the United States was presenting itself, rightly or wrongly, as an honest broker seeking to resolve the Israel-Palestine confrontation. Again, whatever the merits of the claim, but no longer. The current U.S. stance is captured succinctly by two leading specialists on the region with long government service, Robert Malley and Aaron David Miller, and in their words, boiled down to its essence, the administration's message to the Palestinians is, you've lost, get over it, which is pretty fair enough. So let's, a few words to look into the background of all of this. I begin with World War II, which led to a radical change in world order. The United States emerged from the war in a position of power that had absolutely no historical precedent. The primary concern in the Middle East of the United States since World War II has been to maintain its dominance over this critical region. It's a major center of the fossil fuel energy production. It's also a geostrategic prize. And the U.S., Israel, Saudi alliance triangle, which is now emerging, is the centerpiece of this strategy. So Washington is, in fact, constructing a reactionary alliance, which includes the most repressive, harsh Arab dictatorships, the oil dictatorships of the Gulf, Egypt now under the most brutal dictatorship of its history. They fall together, and Israel is among them. And the goal is to confront the influence of Iran, which is regarded in the United States as a grave threat that's unique to the United States. The fact of the matter is that in the world, there's a different country that's regarded as the greatest threat to peace. We're part of it. There was actually one poll. There are international polls every year that are study world opinion. Gallup organization, major organization, and in 2013, for the first time, they asked the question, which country is the gravest threat to world peace? The United States had no competitors. way behind. And second place was Pakistan, inflated by the Indian vote. Other countries are barely mentioned. It's unlikely that many people know about this because that poll wasn't reported in the United States. You could find out about it elsewhere. And also, that's the last time that that question was asked in the polls. You can ask why. But in the United States, commonly, Iran is the greatest threat to world peace. Why? Well, we can turn to U.S. intelligence. They give the answer regularly. Presentations to Congress and so on. Quite different from public discourse. Since the overthrow of the U.S.-backed dictatorship in Iran in 1979, Iran has pursued an independent course, and it poses a deterrent to the free exercise of force by those who want to rampage in the region. There are two, the United States and its Israeli client. That's a serious threat. And in fact, that's for the public, there's a different rhetorical stance, of course, confronting Iranian terror and aggression. But U.S. intelligence is very much on target. Actually, the government of Iran is a threat to its own population. But beyond that, the threat is the threat of deterrence to those who want to be free to use force without constraints. In this respect, U.S. intelligence is much more accurate than the public discourse. Well, in this emerging system, Palestinians are simply a nuisance, kind of like Native Americans, to whom they're often compared, in fact, their fate, some analogies. Thanks in no small part to massive U.S. support over many years, in Gaza, 2 million people survive, barely survive, half of them children. The territory will very soon be literally uninhabitable, according to international monitors, UN and others. This is after years of brutal siege, regular destructive assault, and carefully administered diet, as it's called officially by the occupiers. The diet is designed to keep people barely alive, because it doesn't look good if 2 million people die, but to survive barely beyond that. There has been one so-called lifeline for Palestinians, namely the relief agency, the International Relief Agency, UNRWA. Trump has responded to this by cutting the lifeline. That's the way to deal with the impending catastrophe. No more funding for the relief agency. And Trump was kind enough to announce his reasons. What he said is, Palestinians show no appreciation of respect for him, as he offers them what he calls his ultimate deal, which in fact ends all hopes for minimal rights, while handing Jerusalem over to Israel. Actually, it's vastly expanded Greater Jerusalem, about 5 times as large as Jerusalem ever was, including Palestinian villages in the surrounding area. And as a special gesture of contempt, he accompanied this by cutting funding for Palestinian hospitals in East Jerusalem. Well, that's Gaza. That's how you teach them to show respect for their torturer. Turn to Lebanon and the miserable Shatila refugee camp in Beirut. Shatila still reeking of the Israeli coordinated slaughter that culminated its murderous 1982 invasion. Happened to be the occasion for the book Fateful Triangle that I wrote 35 years ago. In Shatila, where I've been, children play in the mud in dark alleys where they're going to spend the rest of their lives, as will their children. Visitors are invited to the small rooms where the families try to survive and are shown their major treasure, the key to the home in Galilee from which they were expelled during the Nakba. I've seen many scenes of misery and terror around the world, not like Chris, who's seen far more, but enough. However, I've seen very few that evoke such pathos as these little children playing in the mud in the dark alleys, with that being their fate forever. They did have one ray of light, the UNRWA school, UNRWA-funded school in the slum. That's now extinguished thanks to the leader of the free world and thanks to our silence about it. Turning to the West Bank, Israel is pursuing the systematic policy in which it's been engaged since 1967, since shortly after the 1967 war, the program of creating a greater Israel that will take over everything of value in the West Bank and effectively incorporate it into Israel with vast settlement and infrastructure projects. It's kind of de facto annexation, which will sooner or later turn into de jure annexation. All of this is illegal. It's been determined by every relevant high authority. But laws are for the weak if power is not confronted. That's our task. Well, as in neo-colonies generally, Palestinian elites are offered refuge. They can enjoy a Western-style life in Ramallah, while I'm now quoting, 90% of the population of the West Bank live in 165 separate islands, ostensibly under the control of the Palestinian Authority, but actual Israeli control. That's Nathan Thrall, who's the senior Middle East analyst for the International Crisis Groups. Final occupied area, the Syrian Golan Heights, which Israel annexed in violation of Security Council orders. That's been forgotten, along with its inhabitants, most of whom were expelled. The Syrian Golan Heights, I should say. Well, these policies have been pursued systematically by all governments in Israel, what are called left, right, including the moderate doves, government of Shimon Peres, for example, former president, considered a leading peace activist. He's the one who happened to have initiated settlement deep inside the West Bank. They've all relied crucially on the enormous economic, military, and diplomatic support of the United States. And one might say that it's to Trump's credit that with the vulgarity that he's mastered, that at least he has exposed what has been the essence of U.S. policy for many decades. Now, I don't mean to suggest that the Palestinian cause is lost. In fact, quite the contrary. But the picture today is pretty grim, can be changed. This U.S.-Israel Saudi triangle is not actually new. Saudi Arabia has been the closest ally of the United States in the region since the discovery of the incomparable oil reserves there back in the 1930s. During World War II, there was actually a kind of a mini war going on between Britain and the United States as to who was going to take over this extraordinarily valuable surprise. The United power relations dictated the outcome. The United States replaced Britain, and in the following years it gradually displaced Britain, which had been the former hegemonic power, and the U.S. took that over. Britain became a kind of client state. In 1948, Israel won its independence. This, as you know, was accompanied by the expulsion or flight and terror of the vast majority of the indigenous population. And that impressed a number of people, including the U.S. military. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were impressed by Israel, the success of Israeli organized violence, and concluded that back in 48 that Israel is the second major military power in the Middle East, second after Turkey, and that it could become a solid base for projection of U.S. power. Well, it took some time for this to become realized, but the alliance was formed, really took shape in the current form in 1967. In 1967, Israel performed a major service for the United States and Saudi Arabia. Namely, it destroyed their main enemy, the main center of secular Arab nationalism. And it's worth noting that very much like Britain before it, the United States has overwhelmingly tended to support radical Islam against secular nationalism, which is considered a much more dangerous force. Well, since that time, the U.S.-Saudi alliance has, and the U.S.-Israel alliance as well, they've solidified in numerous ways. Theoretically, Israel and the Arab oil dictatorships have been at war, but informal relations have developed over the years, and under Trump, they're no longer concealed. This is an open alliance of reactionary states. Well, Saudi Arabia, of course, is the center of radical Islam, also a missionary state. It's devoted to spreading its version of extremist Islam throughout the Arab world, the mosques, madrasas, Quranic schools, and so on, which happen to be the main ideological source of what we call Islamic terrorism. Turning to the other two legs of the triangle, United States and Israel, there are some interesting similarities, namely in the rise of radical religious right-wing nationalism. It's actually studied in an interesting study that came out in Israel quite recently. There's a report of it. You can read it in Israel's leading journal, Haaretz. And it shows that the United States and Israel are remarkably similar to Saudi Arabia in certain ways, namely in right-wing religious extremism. It is actually studying the U.S. and Israel, and Saudi Arabia it takes for granted. And it finds striking parallels between the U.S. and Israel in religious extremism, right-wing religious extremism, differing from the rest of the West. And let me just quote its main conclusions. Israelis and Americans lead the West in their belief in a right-wing version of God, a factor that can help explain their unique relationship and shared animosity towards secularizing Europe. In Israel, 80% of the dominant right wing, or religious right wing, regard Jews as the chosen people with a God-given right. Actually, that's 60% of the whole country, 80% of the religious right. God-given chosen people, God-given right to the country. That's a view shared by U.S. evangelicals, who form, as Chris mentioned, a substantial popular base for the Republican Party. And by now, the main center of support for Israel in the United States used to be liberal Democrats, but that's shifting. Going on with a quote from Arendt, it's hard to escape the conclusion that religion, in this particular version, has assumed a more pivotal role than ever in the special relationship between the U.S. and Israel. Here's another backdrop to the rapidly warming relations between Israel and Eastern European countries, in which religion, again, right-wing religion, plays a central role, usually in tandem with nationalism and ethnocentrism, and the tense political relations between both Israel and the European Union, and recently between the European Union and Washington, can also be delineated by religious beliefs. Israelis and Americans view Europe as godless and decadent, but for the European Union, Israel and the United States are drifting into fundamentalist crazy land. That's Haaretz. So the U.S. Israeli Saudi triangle, the alliance, has cultural foundations alongside the dominant geopolitical and economic concerns which go far back. Well, in Israel, this is an increasing tendency in recent years, and there is one difference between the United States and Israel in that respect. In Israel, it's the younger generation that's increasingly drawn to religious extremism, which is not true in the United States. Actually, these tendencies were predicted long ago, right at the outset of the occupation in 1967 by a number of astute Israeli observers, most notably, most famously, the respected Israeli sage Yehoshua Leibovitz, as he understood and warned, a shift to the far right is a rather natural outgrowth of the colonization project, just as doctrines of white supremacy are a very natural outgrowth of slavery and extermination or dispersal of the native population. When you have your jackboot on somebody's neck, it's not very good for the psyche. Leibovitz, in fact, predicted back in 1969 that as long as the occupation continued, Israelis would become what he called Judeo-Nazis. Somebody other than Leibovitz couldn't have gotten away with that phrase, but he was so respected that he could. Well, about 90 years ago, from Mussolini's prison cells, Antonio Gramsci described the roots of the emerging fascist crisis of the day. And as he put it, the crisis is that the old is dying and the new cannot be born, and in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Well, today is not the 90s, not the 30s, but as Mark Twain once observed, history doesn't repeat, but it does often rhyme. These are insights that merit some thought and concerted action.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. It's now my pleasure to introduce another giant intellectual, Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl. He's one of the world's leading authorities on Sharia, Islamic law, and Islam, a prominent scholar in the field of human rights and one of the world's leading critics of the Saudi royal family and Wahhabism. He is professor of law at UCLA and founder of the Usuli Institute. He is the author of numerous works, including The Great Theft, Wrestling Islam from the Extremists, The Search for Beauty in Islam, and Reasoning with God, Reclaiming Sharia in the Modern Age. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl.
Thank you very much. One hardly knows where to start. One of sort of the most iconic moments that I'm actually sad to say that I rather predicted in probably an underread book, a book called And God Knows the Soldiers. An iconic moment in which a representative of the Israeli military, the IDF, delivers a message in Arabic to Muslims. And in this message, the IDF's representative reminds Muslims that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab is a great reformer and a great theologian, and quotes Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. He thinks he accurately quotes Ibn Taymiyyah, but he doesn't manage that. But he does accurately quote Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, calling him the great reformer of Islam. This just happened about a year ago, or even less. Now, it's an iconic moment because you can, all the deceptions are removed, all the camouflage is removed, and you can see the natural and even umbilical relationship between the outlook of Zionists and the outlook of Wahhabis internally, the way Wahhabis see the Muslim world, see themselves. The truth of the matter is that Wahhabism has, and this, by the way, it's rooted in its very origins, has a part of its theology known as al-wala wal-bara, or the theology of pure monotheism, in which you reject any fidelity or any loyalty to anything but an Islamic ideology. And so on the one hand, you have that, but the other hand, it is coupled with a focus, nearly obsessive focus, on ritualism and opposition to ethical, rational thought and human autonomy and even human creativity and inspiration. At the social level, and I underscore at the social level, at the political level, what Wahhabi theology adopts an absolute pragmatism and realism in which the theology teaches that al-wala wal-bara, or this strict monotheistic loyalty, cannot be applied critically to the ruler. So on the one hand, it has this sort of revolutionary activist component in which you are supposed to denounce any loyalties to anything and anyone but Muslims who follow the true creed. On the other hand, there is an obsessive focus on ritualism and a doctrine of absolute obedience to the ruler. In Wahhabis, in the case of Wahhabism, of course, it's a Saudi monarch. And it had never resolved this tension within Wahhabi theology. On the one hand, you can easily co-opt this theology into a doctrine of open warfare and open jihad, if you will, against not just heretical Muslims, but all Muslims, or all non-Muslims, Christian, Jews, and so on. But on the other hand, there is a remarkable emphasis, an obsessive influence on the ruler cannot be questioned and criticized or criticized. So I'll even give you, just so you get I'm sure the Muslims in this room will probably know what I'm talking about immediately, but to give you an insight into the world people like me live in. Since the Khashoggi thing, very famous Wahhabi clergy like Sudais and Al-Huzaifi, these are people who are recognized all over the Muslim world as theologians with a substantial amount of authority. In the case of Sudais, he is actually the formal official imam of Mecca. He leads prayer in Mecca. In Mecca, he gives the Jum'ah, the khutbah, and Friday congregation prayer. They all appeared recently on various media sites, including Saudi-funded television, reminding Muslims that it is a grave sin, not just a grave sin to criticize the ruler, but a grave sin to think ill of the ruler. Whatever the ruler tells you, you must accept as an Islamic obligation. They even went a step further and said that the only possible way that you can interact in, or hold a ruler accountable rather, is that you counsel the ruler privately. Now, what if, of course, if you try to get an appointment with Salman or his crown prince to counsel him privately, good luck. So what do you do if you can't meet with Salman or the crown prince to counsel them privately? Well, Saifi and Sudais and a whole host of them had an ready answer to that. They said, well, you talk to a trusted imam like themselves and trust them to communicate the message to the ruler. But your job as a Muslim is absolute, unquestioning obedience. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the theological juristic debates about this. This is sort of the bread and butter of what I live with all the time. But this brings this brings us to sort of the heart of the matter, the big question. Why were all the camouflages stripped? Why was it at this point in history that the Saudis decided that they will no longer go with the pretense of caring about the Palestinians? They will no longer go with the pretense of not having sold Palestine and Jerusalem decades ago. Why is it that they felt desperate enough to lay naked the entire dynamic and entire relationship towards power, colonial power, and their disdain towards their own native culture? And the explanation, in my view, is quite simple. The Saudis and the Emiratis, especially the Saudis and the Emiratis, saw the Arab Spring. Now, remember that the Arab Spring, you had masses of people saying, "Aish, Hurriya, Adala, Ijtimaiya," freedom, bread, and justice. And since the Iranian Revolution, there has been an obsession with something akin to the Iranian Revolution taking place anywhere in the Arab world, or the Muslim world for that matter. And the Arab Spring terrified Al Saud and the rulers of Abu Dhabi and Dubai, far more than even the king of Jordan or the Moroccan king, far more than the natural tension between a monarchy and any revolution, as we remember from British and French history, the way Britain reacted to the French Revolution and so on. Far more than that, to have a Muslim ego that is unbroken and unsubjugated and uncompliant is unacceptable to the monarchies that have for decades monopolized the resources and finances of the richest countries in the Muslim world. To have anything akin to these calls, freedom, justice, and bread. Now remember, Saudi Arabia has a very high unemployment rate and has a serious problem with poverty. If you go to Saudi Arabia, you will meet tons of people who are homeless, who literally eat from the garbage. At the same time that they will waste billions. I mean, there's a video on YouTube that you can fish out where Crown Prince Salman gives his mistress a gift of $2 million, costs $2 million, and someone took a undercover film of the whole gifting process, and you can find it on the net, like you can find a lot of other stuff. I mean, a ruling family and a theology that completely exploited and wasted the natural resources and the human potential and energy of its own native population. When Wahhabism arose early on in the 17th century, what was embedded in what the Wahhabi movement itself, and I wrote all of this material in the 90s at a time that no one talked about Wahhabis, and I'm sad to have lived long enough to see everything that I feared actually materialize. Wahhabis saw themselves as a return to a pristine and pure Islam, but they were thoroughly permeated with an attitude of absolute inferiority as an ethnic and nativist and racial group towards their colonizers. That same racial and ethnic paradigm permeates everything Al Saud and the Emiratis, who, by the way, can write English and speak English much better than they can write or speak Arabic, especially classical Arabic. They were educated in Western institutions, in the best British institutions that train royalty. Their culture is a thoroughly westernized colonial culture rather than anything that emerges from the native roots of the Islamic civilization itself. And as such, they always saw the white colonizer as naturally superior and saw their own people with a prism of inferiority and absolute lack of confidence and ego. The only thing they want from their own people is to shut the hell up. That's the only thing they expect from Muslims. Shut the hell up and do what you're told. The entire Khashoggi affair is a really good example. On the one hand, like all of you, your heart is broken for Khashoggi. On the other hand, the sense of degradation and absolute humiliation as you see all the media that is not friendly, and I emphasize, not friendly to Saudi Arabia, all they care about is what the West thought of the murder of Khashoggi. What matters is whether Americans or Europeans are going to make it an issue or not make it an issue. No one cares about what Muslims think. We, even our most enlightened intellectuals, have ingrained in them that racist attitude that a Muslim, by definition, is exotic and foreign and alien. Now, the Wahhabis play amazingly well. I'll give you another wonderful example. For years, this is from the time that I came to the United States, early 80s. Thanks to Wahhabi influence, as a jurist, I got sick and tired of listening or responding to Muslims that come and say, brother, listening to music is haram. You cannot listen to music. You cannot have this. You cannot have that. Ad nauseum. Now, let me tell you, this position, this Wahhabi position, was maintained for decades. Decades. Listening to music is haram, leave alone singing or rapping. That's, now you've got a one-way speed ticket to hell, right? Lo and behold, Salman decides that music is no longer haram. And Huzaifi and others like al-Mashari, who are famous Quranic reciters, by the way. They recite the Quran, I don't like the recitation of the Quran because my ear is used to the tabaqat system. Okay. I don't like Saudi reciters of the Quran, I have to admit, but that's a side. Those reciters of the Quran sing songs praising Salman and the Crown Prince and exalting the virtues of Saudi. They turn from Quranic reciters, sworn. I have a volume this big, about 12 volumes of the Fatawa, the responsa, telling me that all music is haram, all dancing is haram, everything is haram, haram, haram. And an instant like that, in an instant, overnight, not only is it not haram anymore, but they're actually performing songs, writing songs and writing music and performing. That is Wahhabism. For Muslims, the danger of Wahhabism is not because they're going to commit terrorist attacks. Terrorism has a whole ideological lineage that you can find rooted in the nihilist movement in Russia, in the early Russian terror campaigns, and the early terrorists in France that belonged to the anarchist movement, and so on and so forth. A lot of these the ideologies of those who blow themselves up and revel in the orgy of violence and blood goes back to the French anarchists and the Russian anarchists and the type of imagery that they created. But the risk of Wahhabism for Muslims is that it suffocates the hell out of us. And it makes us a subjugated, racially inferior people. No one gives a shit what a Muslim says or feels. As the Khashoggi thing was going on, I have been keeping track of assassinations of a journalist in Jordan, the disappearance of people, a famous writer who was a good friend of mine, an economist, disappeared in Egypt. And even because of a dispute with, and one of my Egyptian singers in the modern age suck overall. There is one possible exception. What was her name again? No, Kulthum, she's God. No. Astaghfirullah, how can you say that? You can never, no, Kulthum is in a class herself. Yeah, Amal Maher. No, I'm talking about not even 10% of Kulthum, a woman called Amal Maher, who at least was not trash, okay? Any of you have listened to Amal Maher? Show of hands. Okay, she's not trash. Because of a dispute with a Saudi prince, the Egyptian government bans the music of Amal Maher simply because she supposedly married a Saudi prince in secret, a secret marriage. He beat her up in the street in front of Egyptian guards. When she filed a complaint against them, The Egyptian government responded by banning the music of Amal Maher and the appearance of Amal Maher in any media outlet. And then a student of mine and a friend just told me that, in fact, she is disappeared in Egypt. This is the life, this is the logic that Wahhabism and Saudi Arabia brings to Muslims all over. Shut the hell up and do what you're told. I will tell you, to me, I understand the Treaty of Westphalia and the Vienna Conventions and all that stuff about the sanctity of consulates and embassies, something that, but at the same time that we are outraged at the torture and murder of Khashoggi, who, by the way, think about it, was light-skinned, didn't look like an Arab, and wrote in the Washington Post. If he did not write in the Washington Post and he did not have the skin he did, he would be like many of my friends that were killed or disappeared and no one cares. At the time that Khashoggi is killed, 15 million people in Yemen are dying. Sisi murdered 5,000 people in Rabaa and no one cares. A bomb is dropped on a Muslim somewhere around the world every 10 to 15 minutes and no one cares. As a Muslim, and I'll tell you my story with Saudi Arabia since I promised my wife I would share it. They tried to kill me 3 times. Once with a bullet, once with a bomb, and once with a pin, with a poison pin that was stuck in the back of my neck. I assure you, and mark my words, if Salman comes out of this thanks to Trump and Christian nationalism and Jewish nationalism, and thanks to the fact, remember, that in the same way the IDF had a spokesman praise Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab as a true reformer of Islam, Israel made clear in the current events that they trust the Saudis and they don't trust the Turks. And they made very clear and continue to make clear right now that if you want to favor with Israel, then support the crown prince who's going to accept the deal of the century. The deal of the century which ends the Palestinian issue forever, gives Jerusalem to the Israelis. A footnote, did you know that the Emiratis have been buying up property all over Jerusalem and selling it to Jewish settlers? Did you know that? Why are they doing that? I'll tell you, because they want to end the whole issue of Jerusalem. They want to end the ghost, the threatening phantom of political Islam or the Islamist, which basically translates the one thing that they are scared of is an Islam that accepts and adapts itself to a democracy. That's the real threat. That's why they tried to kill me and killed Khashoggi and will kill many others. And as the Crown Prince Salman survives, because I do think he will survive, mark my words, he will come after the rest of us, and meaning rest of us Muslims, with a vengeance. I promised my wife that I would stand here and say, if I disappear, all of you know who did it. And or if you find me dead and they say he killed himself, I have no intention of killing myself. But this is the gripping fear and the abject racism that we live with as Muslims. You look into the eyes of any Muslim who has not joined a terrorist organization, you will find them broken. Broken as a human being. Thanks to Wahhabi theology, and thanks for the death of the dream of democracy, and thanks for the death of the call of Egyptians, Syrians, Yemenis, Libyans, Bahrainis, who said freedom bread, and social justice. And the so-called protectors of democracy in the West didn't give a shit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Abou El Fadl. I'd like to begin by asking each of you a question, and first to Chris. Can you speak about the significance of Trump moving the American embassy to Jerusalem in Israel and Palestine? What is the significance to the Christian right and to Christian Zionists in the United States?
How's that? Okay. So it's a huge issue for the Christian right because of their bizarre apocalyptic theological view that the end times will occur on, the fields of Armageddon, and which is located, according to them, in Israel. It, of course, advances the Zionist agenda, which is now fused with the Christian right. And it is just one more blow towards Palestinian rights. Of course, it's illegal under international law to in any way bolster the Israeli occupation. But I think you're right, that the kind of benefit, if there is a benefit to Trump, is that he's lifted the veil. Barack Obama did nothing for the Palestinians, in no way advanced the peace process, which was always a joke. In fact, of course, settlements were expanded in the West Bank. More and more territory was seized in East Jerusalem. I think it's part of this long camp, this kind of slow motion ethnic cleansing that has been in place since 1948 and is now accelerating to keep Palestinians trapped in ghettos or Bantustans where they struggle at such a basic subsistence level in the eyes of the Israelis that all of their energy goes into finding enough to eat and clean water, of which there is almost none in Gaza.
Thank you. And Noam, I'd like to ask you another question that we discussed earlier. Recently, you said on Democracy Now! That Israeli intervention in U.S. elections vastly overwhelms anything the Russians may have done. Can you elaborate on that? How is it that both Israelis themselves and the Israeli lobby in the U.S. functions?
Well, sometimes it is so blatant that it's kind of mind-boggling. So you may recall that the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, showed up at the invitation of some right-wing members of Congress to deliver an address to the joint session of Congress without notifying the White House even, in which he used his address to condemn Obama's policies, mainly with regard to Iran. Obama had helped initiated the negotiations that led to the joint program, the Iran nuclear deal, and this is anathema to Netanyahu, who wants the U.S. to support an attack on Iran. So here's a prime minister of another country showing up in Congress, completely ignoring the state executive, the White House, and telling them, you guys have got to completely reverse his policy. It's almost impossible to think of a form of intervention in the legislative process that exceeds this. Now, this is only a very small part of it. You just take a look at the main funders of both the Republican and the Democratic Party. The Republican Party, it's people like Sheldon Adelson, tens of millions of dollars, ultra-right, a supporter of the ultra-right Israeli nationalism settlement programs. On the Democratic side, Chaim Saban is a huge, another billionaire, huge supporter. You look through the rest of the donors, it's the same. There are lobbying groups, open lobbying groups like AIPAC, which basically agencies of the Israeli government, which are constantly twisting the arms of people in Congress. It is so far beyond anything that is attributed to the Russians that you just can't even compare it. And I should say that, side comment, when we're considering the intervention in our pristine democratic process, it's worth bearing in mind that even the Israeli intervention, which is far beyond any other country, is minuscule as compared with the corruption of the political process by simply funding of candidates. Now, this is not just since Citizens United that opened the faucet a little wider, but it goes back over a century. You go back to 1895. There was a great famous campaign manager, Mark Hanna, was asked once, what are the important things that you need for a political campaign? And he said, the first thing is money, and the second thing is money. And I've forgotten what the third is. That was the 1890s. And in fact, extensive, important work in academic social science, political science, which shows that you can literally predict the outcome of an election with remarkable precision simply by looking at the one variable of campaign spending. That's both for president and for Congress, and it runs through the 2016 campaign, incidentally. And that's just a small part of it, since electability depends on campaign funding. That means your congressional representative, once he or she is elected, their first task is to get funding for the next election. Meanwhile, what happens to the legislative process? Well, corporate lobbies are invited to talk to the staff, the congressional staff, and instruct them about what the legislation ought to be. And this reaches the point where they actually write the legislation. They're written by corporate lobbyists, signed by the congressional representative. This is one reason why other work demonstrates that about 70% of the voting population, the lower 70% on the income scale, are completely disenfranchised, literally, in the sense that their own representatives pay absolutely no attention to their opinions. They're listening to the donor class. Talking about interference in the elections in a system like this is kind of ludicrous in the first place. But if we want to talk about foreign interference, there's nothing remotely to compare with the Israeli interference. It's perfectly open and blatant. They don't even try to conceal it.
Thank you. Dr. Abou El Fadl, I'd like you to speak about we hear a lot less about the Saudi lobby in the US, but we know that it's present. Anyone who's been in academia knows how difficult it is to write a critique of Saudi Arabia in the United States because of the endowed chairs that the Saudi government supports here. You're one of maybe a handful of scholars who have written anything. We also see in Mohammed bin Salman's recent PR tour of the U.S. This sort of close relationship with government, Washington, D.C., media, Silicon Valley. Can you speak to how the Saudi alliance functions in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, there's one level where there are the actual professional lobbyists. Saudi Arabia spends billions of dollars, and the Emirates, and actually now Qatar has as well, on lobbyists. There are about 100 lobbyists registered as lobbying on behalf of the Saudi government right now, and that's public information. But the other level, we cannot ignore the fact that the Saudi royalty is also have the title of the guardians of the holy sites, Mecca and Medina. And that's a very powerful moral position that you can leverage, and they do leverage. Now, that coupled with the venues for funding through Saudi Arabia don't necessarily go through the government directly. In other words, if you are starting some type of organization or opening up an Islamic center or whatever in the US, usually your best financiers, your best sources of raising funds will be people from Saudi Arabia that are donating money with the approval of the government, but it's not officially coming from the government. And it's, they would not dare donate to anything that the government doesn't approve of, but at the same time, the money is not leveraged directly. Up until 9/11, very few Muslims dared say anything critical about the Saudi ruling family because simply of ostracism, if not direct violence. It was a very open secret that the Saudis had funded numerous institutions, Muslim institutions in the West, and these institutions were not going to give you a platform if you will be critical of Saudi Arabia. That type of, that was broken a bit. The shield that against criticism constructed by Saudi Arabia was cracked a bit after 9/11, where through critiques of Wahhabism, people started accepting critiques against Saudi Arabia. What, in the past 5 years, there has been a very aggressive thrust by Saudi Arabia to restore that sense of, what is the word I'm looking for? Halo around the Saudi ruling family, so that people would feel that if they critique the Saudi royal family, then they're also critiquing the guardian of the holy sites, and they're critiquing, they're if not committing a major sin, then risking falling into some major sin. I mean, so this, in his last khutbah, came right out and called the Crown Prince divinely inspired, and even said that the Crown Prince, he quoted the Prophet, a report attributed to the Prophet, that God sends a reformer to rejuvenate the Islamic faith every 100 years. And he said, well, that's the Crown Prince, Salman. So we should all celebrate the savior of the Islamic faith for the century has been now revealed. You know, that position towards the holy sites plus the finances gives them an amazing amount of influence. What has materialized in the past, since in the past 5 years especially, is the threat of physical violence and abductions, which I believe that the Emiratis and the Saudis have become far more vulgar about. And of course, the election of Trump has given them a sense of immunity, and that's, for those of us who live in this world, is quite frightening.
Chris, I'd like to ask you to speak about nationalism. We've discussed tonight religious nationalism, but you've alluded to the dangers of secular nationalism and what might be called secular fundamentalism. How is this wed so closely to war in our society, and how can we essentially not allow those in this country or any other country to define what it means to be an American?
Well, nationalism is a disease because the flip side of nationalism is always racism. I was in New York for the attacks on 9/11, and like other reporters from the New York Times, I stuffed notebooks in my pocket and walked down the West Side Highway. I was almost there when Building 7 collapsed. And my son, who was 10 at the time, asked, what's the difference between the people in their cars who have the big American flags and the people waving the small flags? And I said, well, the people waving the big American flags are the really big assholes. The tragedy of 9/11 is that, and I was in the Middle East almost immediately afterwards, where the huge majority of Muslims were appalled at what had been done in the name of their religion. And if we had not drunk deep of that dark elixir of nationalism, if we had had the courage to be vulnerable, if we had understood that the only way to defeat terrorism is to isolate terrorists within their own society, we would be far safer and secure than we are today. But we reacted in a mirror image of Al-Qaeda and began dropping iron fragmentation bombs all over the Middle East. And nationalism, as Danilo Kish, the great Serbian writer, said, is always espoused and promoted by ignoramuses, people who are culturally, linguistically, and historically illiterate, who see the world solely through the eyes of the nationalist, and therefore see everyone outside of their nationalist circle as nationalists like them. And it's no great surprise to anyone in this room that we have been the most effective recruiter for radical jihadists throughout the Middle East. We have created one failed state after another. We've utterly upended in 17 years of war the very goals that we purported to embrace to justify the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. In Syria, we flooded the place with weapons and then started bombing the people we gave the weapons to, in essence acting as Hezbollah's air force, since Hezbollah was fighting with Assad. Iraq as a unified country is never coming back. Libya is a failed state. And we are just pushing outwards with no understanding or even questioning of what our goals are. And so nationalism, and we have, unfortunately, a president who has just declared himself a nationalist. He's not particularly sentient about many things, but he certainly understands what using that word means. And it is a signal to his rabid neo-fascist base. So, yeah, nationalism is, and I watched it in war after war. It's a deep disease, and it always entails the elevation of us and the denigration of everyone else.
Professor Chomsky, you've been a leading critic of U.S. imperial wars in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and you've also spoken about how many Americans, when asked, how many people died in the war in Vietnam, I think answered 200,000, and you said it's actually closer to 3 to 4 million, and compared this to a denial of the Holocaust. And yet since the first Iraq war, through the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the sanctions, it's estimated that about 6 million Muslims have died in the Middle East through US bombing campaigns. What does that tell us, and how do we steer this country in another direction away from violence?
Well, I think the situation is a little bit worse than what you described. The main study of estimates of Vietnamese dead was 100,000, and that was in a university setting, which is in a liberal, very liberal community, in an elite university. What you'd get if you asked this question across the country, I have no idea. It hasn't been done. But that was 100,000, which is a tiny fraction of the number of Vietnamese who died. During the war itself, it was probably close to 4 million, and many are continuing to die from the effects of chemical warfare. We don't know how many. So it is very much like Holocaust denial. Somebody who said that, if in Germany, at an elite university, people were asked how many Jews died in the Holocaust, and they said, say 100,000. You think there's a problem in Germany, a cultural, social, educational problem, and that's something that we have to face. Going on to Iraq, there was a sanctions. You mentioned the sanctions. This is before the war. This is under Clinton, not Bush. Under Clinton, there was a sanctions program administered by the UN, but of course it was a U.S. program. The administrators of the program were distinguished international diplomats. The first one, Irish, resigned in protest because he described the sanctions as genocidal. He didn't want to be part of it. The second one, Hans von Sponeck, also a distinguished international diplomat, stayed on who incidentally, both of them had detailed information about what was happening in Iraq. They had investigators all over the place. They certainly knew more about Iraq than the CIA, which admittedly is not a terribly high bar, but probably had the best information about Iraq of any Westerners. Von Sponeck also was completely appalled. After a few years, resigned in protest, charged that they were genocidal, and went on to write a book, an important book, called A Different Form of War. You probably haven't read the book or heard about it. And one of the reasons is it wasn't mentioned in the United States. No reviews, no commentary, scholarship doesn't refer to it. It's a detailed examination, very close examination of the way the sanctions were were destroying the society, carrying out what he called genocide, killing hundreds of thousands of people, and furthermore, strengthening the tyrant. People were compelled to rely on Saddam's fairly efficient rationing system simply to survive. And if that hadn't, I'm now going beyond von Sponeck, I've talked to him about it actually, and he pretty much agrees that it's very likely that this saved Saddam from being overthrown from within, which has happened to dictators over and over. Somoza, Marcos, Mobutu, Ceausescu, one after another has been overthrown by popular movements within, even though they were brutal and harsh dictators. It might very well have been the fate of Saddam, but he was strengthened by the sanctions which were carrying out virtual genocide, in von Sponeck's words, against the population that was forced, that was decimated and forced to simply rely on him for survival. Do we know anything about this? Like I say, the book that details it is unknown, not reviewed, not mentioned. Well, that's a particular form of the nationalist pathology that Chris was talking about, as is the horrifying case of the estimate of the toll that our war took in Vietnam. And you can add this in case after case. Just take a look at today's newspapers. Huge uproar about what's called a caravan of people from Central America coming to the United States, according to our leader, an invasion of the country. He's sending 1,000 troops down there. It's about one soldier for every child in the caravan. Who are these people? These are people fleeing from regions that we destroyed. Reagan's wars in Central America were vicious and brutal. Hundreds of thousands of people killed, masses tortured, widows, orphans, every form of atrocity you can think of. Trump, in fact, is imitating his hero Reagan with his hysteria, building up hysteria about the invasion from Central America. You may recall that in 1985, Ronald Reagan strapped on his cowboy boots and declared a national emergency because the Nicaraguan army was 2 days' march from Harlingen, Texas, just about to overwhelm us. And the country was terrified, just as many people are terrified now. This, for whatever reason, is probably the most frightened country in the world, has been for a long time. I don't know if that corresponds to your experience, but I've seen nothing like it elsewhere. And it doesn't take much for the most ridiculous claim to be made. And this is a case where people are not just fleeing, but fleeing from what recreated. It's not just Reagan's wars, which are bad enough. Most of them are coming from Honduras. Why Honduras? It's been a pretty awful state for many years because of long-term U.S. intervention and domination. But something happened in 2009. There was a mildly reformist president, Mel Zelaya. He was kicked out in a military coup. He was condemned all over Latin America and most of the world, with one notable exception. The Obama administration would not call it a military coup for a very simple reason. If you call it a military coup, you're forced by congressional legislation to terminate military aid to the military junta that's ruling it. So therefore, for Obama, it wasn't a military coup. Honduras very quickly turned into a real horror chamber, the homicide capital of the world. Then came a fake election under the military junta. It was condemned by the Organization of American States, by Latin American countries. Again, one exception. It was praised by the United States as a move towards democracy. That just increased the horrors and the terror. End result, people fleeing. Well, and therefore we cringe in terror because we're being invaded by these miserable families fleeing from horror and destruction. That's a form of nationalism which is pretty hard to describe.
Thank you. My last question is for you, Dr. Abou El Fadl. There seems to be a contradiction with this alliance, many contradictions actually, but one of them is that each of these extremist groups persecute any group that is different from them. People of other denominations within the faith, people of other faiths, secularists, women, and other nations that they're at war with, yet they're allied together. How can we express solidarity across the religious divide at a grassroots level, and also among people of goodwill who may be agnostics or atheists? How can we express solidarity with the peoples of Saudi, of Yemen, of Palestine, and Voices for Peace in Israel and the United States, so that we can work together?
Before I address the issue of solidarity, you pointed to something that is really important, and that's the role of the pathology of hate in settler nationalism and also in the type of theological paradigm that has predominated in Wahhabism. And the irony is that it's sorry, excuse me. Wahhabis introduced a theology that undermined and systematically uprooted centuries-old theological doctrines of pluralism and co-Islamic or coexistence within an Islamic umbrella. And that's sort of the fascinating thing, is that the Wahhabis and Al Saud found bed buddies in Islamophobes, because Islamophobes presented a type of Islamic history that, an Islamic history of intolerance and dogmatism, that they actually found quite appealing for very different purposes. Of course, I came in was a lecture that I completely scratched and used none of, because I listened to Chris and Noam Chomsky, and then I thought, okay, I'll trash the lecture. But I want to read to you one quote that it's rather, this is from a British fellow called Palgrave. Actually, hold on one second. Oh, sorry. This is Philby. Philby was a British agent that played a very important role in the birth of Saudi Arabia. At one point, he supposedly converts to Islam, but even when after he reportedly converts to Islam, he continued to have a remarkable racist disdain towards Muslims. He has a wonderful quote describing sort of the nature of Wahhabis, of course, which he actually liked. He was very pro-Wahhabi. Here's the quote. The most compromising characteristics of the Wahhabis, which again, I remind everyone that he actually liked. The most remarkable characteristics of the Wahhabis are their uncompromising hatred of their Muslim neighbors. The Shia are frankly condemned as infidels and polytheists. But it is for the Orthodox congregation of the four Sunni churches, Turks, Egyptians, Hijazis, Syrians, Mesopotamians, Indians, and the like, that the Wahhabis reserve their undiluted venom of their hatred. This was written in the late 1800s, early 1900s, I don't remember exactly. That theological paradigm never departed from Wahhabism. It is a wonderful gift to the elite that monopolizes power. Because if you can demonize everyone else, as Chris said, externalize evil as belonging in everyone else, and then you can, whoever stands with our monopoly of power can be the wonderful epitome of goodness. It lends itself to colonialism, to racism, to capitalism, to elitism, to consumerism, in a fascinating, and endlessly fascinating way. If it didn't have such tragic consequences, I would write poetry about it because it's so fascinating. I don't know how you express solidarity. I know one thing that definitely breaks the back of every Muslim who tries to stand up and take a position and do as the Quran says, testify in justice even if it's against your own self and your loved ones and your family. And that is when you find non-Muslims endorsing either explicitly or implicitly Islamophobes, like that supposed liberal fellow. You mentioned him in your talk, Chris.
Sam Harris?
No, the guy who has a TV show, Bill Maher. Yeah. It breaks your back. And so if you want to express solidarity with Muslims, think about how you can resist Islamophobes and condemn their racism for what it is.
I'm a strong supporter of the BDS movement. Noam may have a break with me on this, but I don't see any other mechanism left by which we're going to protect the Palestinians. The Israelis are terrified of it. Obviously, it's had far more currency in Europe than it is here. But I'm also a strong supporter of a BDS movement for Saudi Arabia. And I think that there have been legitimate critics of those of us who support BDS who've asked that question. Well, if you promote BDS for Israel, what about Saudi Arabia? And I was with Medea Benjamin and others at a conference in Washington a couple years ago to call precisely for that. But I've spent a lot of my life in Gaza. I've seen those bodies of children lined up in the corridors of Shifa Hospital. It's not an abstraction to me. I will never vote for a political candidate who betrays the Palestinian people, which is why I did not vote for Barack Obama, who got up and gave a speech to AIPAC that was written by AIPAC. So my personal response has been to speak in support of BDS.
Thank you. Would either of you, Noam or Khaled, like to add anything?
Actually, it's actually a BD movement. There's no sanctions. And I think it's a very good idea. I started supporting it when it was initiated back in 1997 by Uri Avneri and his Gush Shalom, the peace movement in Israel. And I think it's been supporting it since, but we have to be careful when we support a movement. Something because it's a movement, we have to start asking questions. A movement has principles, and you have to be careful that they don't turn into a catechism. You have to begin to ask yourself, which of the tactics of the program are the successful ones and effective ones, and which tactics are just following some principles that somebody established. And that's a significant question. So I think there are elements of the BD programs which have been extremely successful. So take, say, the Presbyterian Church. That's a very important move for a major. Pardon?
You may not know what they did.
Oh, the Presbyterian Church.
I know because I'm
Yeah.
Presbyterian.
Well, the Presbyterian Church was, after all, a pretty big organization. Took a very strong and I think extremely sensible position. They called for boycott and divestment of anything connected to the Israeli occupied territories, including, crucially, U.S. multinationals that are involved in the occupation, which brings the matter home in ways that we should be not only acting, but it's beginning an open educational program. And other programs that are following, again, the Uri Avneri's original program that are oriented against the occupation, I think have been very successful. And I think those are the ones that can affect policy. And they can go far beyond what they have. So, for example, U.S. military aid to Israel happens to be in direct violation of U.S. law, explicit violation of U.S. law, the so-called Lay law, Patrick Lay, Senator Patrick Lay. The Lay law, part of U.S. law, stipulates that no military aid can be given to any military unit that is involved in systematic human rights violations. Well, Gaza alone is testimonial to massive human rights violations. It's by no means the only case. Same in Lebanon, same in the West Bank, and so on. That's a very, this actually is supported by major human rights groups. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International called for an end to military aid to Israel. Activism and education focused on that could bring in large segments of the American population who don't like the idea of military aid anyway, if it was known. These are things that could be really effective techniques, I think. A lot of, there are many others. Now, there are some that I think are what are sometimes called feel-good rather than do-good tactics. And you've got to be careful about those. So, for example, take, say, academic boycotts. That may annoy Israelis, but it has no effect on policy. In fact, what it does is drive them to the right. And it has a negative effect for Palestinians because as soon as those are initiated, immediately there's a backlash, which often overwhelms the protest. But furthermore, it diverts attention away from the plight of Palestinians to irrelevant questions like academic freedom. We started a big debate about academic freedom. That's not the issue here. And it also raises obvious questions of hypocrisy. If you're going to boycott Tel Aviv University, why not boycott Harvard, which is much more deeply involved in atrocities all over the world, not just in Palestine. So you're off in directions that go away from the issue of the Palestinians and their plight. If you keep to those issues, I think it could be an extremely effective tactic and a way of organizing protests and activism and have an educational impact which can lead further directions. But as in the case of all such programs, tactical issues have to be thought about very seriously. They're not trivial. You have to ask, what are the consequences of the tactic I'm pursuing for the victims? Not, does it make me feel good to do it? What are the consequences for the victims? These are issues that ought to be thought through carefully. And one of the, in my view, flaws of the so-called movement is that it has been largely immune to discussions about these matters. And that's unfortunate. In fact, sometimes it's had very negative consequences. So one of the people who's done more for Palestinians than almost anybody I can think of is Norman Finkelstein. He's been boycotted by the BDS movement because he made some critical comments about it. These are things you have to be careful about. And as soon as I hear the word movement, I immediately begin to cringe a little, because you have to ask yourself, why is it a movement? Why is it not just a set of tactical choices that we have to decide on case by case with careful evaluation of consequences? Those, I think, are things to be worried about.
And I'd like to ask this question to Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl as an expert in U.S. law, international law, Islamic law. What do you think about BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions in Israel, Palestine, or even Saudi Arabia?
I'm one of the academics who's been targeted by these fascist watch groups for adding his name to. I tend to agree with Noam Chomsky that I have very good relations with some academics at Tel Aviv University, and one of them, for instance, is one of the most inspired critics of Arabs performing whiteness and the whole racial dynamics of that type of psychology, where Arabs increasingly try to pretend to be white. And anyway, so she's written some amazing work, and I enjoy it when I invite her to the United States. And I tend to think that, yes, we would get marred in these issues of academic freedom, but part of the problem is that the U.S. has laws that criminalize social boycotts of certain countries, specifically Israel. There's a famous appellate court decision that said that law does not violate the First Amendment. So the technicality in the law, though, is that if the boycott is instituted in order to back up a foreign boycott of Israel, so for instance, if you are supporting an Algerian boycott of Israel, or if the Attorney General can make that type of allegation against you, then it's a felony, and somehow it's not a violation of the First Amendment. So I always think that it's a priority to become active in fixing our freaking laws, because even before the Patriot Act, some of our laws that were legislated to protect Israel are mind-boggling, and people don't know about them. Even there is zero discussions in law schools. I mean, one of the amazing things, and I don't think my law school is an exception, when it comes to anything that has to do with Israel, it's a taboo. We have faculty that will do epileptic fits if we even attempt a discussion of certain things. But even there is a psychological oblivion towards the topics like the genocide that we've inflicted in Iraq and Afghanistan. And even the international law faculty and human rights faculty will talk as if these are not realities. I mean, you rarely find an actual human rights discourse about what we've done and are doing in Afghanistan and Iraq in all of our top law schools, including my own. And I'll add one other point. During Muslims and Arabs were targeted in a variety of ways from 9/11, after the passage of the Patriot Act. And again, our law schools, even law schools that have very good civil liberties program and civil rights programs, very little was produced about what was going on with our Arab and Muslim population. I tie all of this to a colonial racism and imperial racism that we have never rid ourselves of. And we can praise our legal minds. We can say this is a brilliant constitutional or international law professor, although they are dishonest in discourse, although they will ignore realities as gruesome as the Holocaust, and he'd still be touted as a brilliant legal mind and a brilliant international law professor. I have a, I would understand that a lot of people would not necessarily, but agree with me, but I believe that people with a humanitarian principle and focused on Muslims, I believe that Muslims must wake up to the importance of engaging the academia, funding the academia, starting to introduce their voice as American Muslims in US academic institutions or even Western academic institutions. And that until that happens, until the dean knows that there are Muslim donors that will be impressed if there is a discussion about what is going on with Palestinians, and there are Muslim donors who will be very upset if there is no discussion about what's going on, nothing will change. I think that's just the reality of what happens in our academic institutions. I'm actually quite curious what Noam and Chris think of that. If they agree or disagree, because they have far more experience with academia than I do.
I regret that we may have to cut the evening short, but hopefully we'll pick up the conversation after. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight and thank our speakers.